When I tell people I'm an urban planner, the question I usually get is, so what do you do? And this is followed by a number of more specific questions, because I've learned that whether or not you know what an urban planner does, everyone has an opinion about their city or neighborhood. So the follow-up questions go something like this. Who designed my neighborhood? Can planners do something about those guys who drive motorcycles on my block late at night? Can my neighbor park his truck in his front yard or put a vegetable garden there? When will Capitol Point get built? And my favorite question to date, why are there so many bees in downtown? To which I replied that they are wasps, not bees. And this is not because I'm an urban planner, it's because I'm the daughter of a beekeeper. So with the kind of questions I get come a lot of assumptions that people have about urban planners. One of these assumptions is people tend to overestimate what urban planners actually do to change our physical environment. And the other assumption is that it's someone else's role to fix my neighborhood or get my neighbor to take his truck off the front yard. So today, instead of talking to you about what I do as an urban planner, I'd like to talk to you about what anyone can do to participate in urban planning. And I'll use an example from my own life. So I grew up in a small town in upstate New York, in a very rural environment. But I spent a lot of time as a child visiting big cities like Montreal and New York City. And I remember visiting New York City with my mother and taking the train into Grand Central Station. And when we arrived, we'd be surrounded by a swarm of people in business attire who were rushing to their office jobs in Midtown Manhattan. And then we would slowly walk the 5 or 6 blocks across 42nd Street to the Port Authority bus terminal, where we would take the bus to my grandmother's house. And as we would walk along 42nd Street, the crowd would change. It would go from people in business attire to street vendors and panhandlers and squeegee guys, set against a backdrop of Broadway theaters, some of which were in various states of disrepair. And this was my first experience in seeing the economic diversity of a big city and the effects of urban decay or urban disinvestment. So at the age of 22, I moved to New York City. I rented a 600 square foot apartment with a friend of mine in a 6th-floor walk-up, and we lived on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. This was a neighborhood that had been settled in the early 20th century by mostly Eastern European immigrants, and then more recently by those of Hispanic descent. And I loved this urban environment. I remember being able to hear jazz music on summer nights when my window was open from the bar across the street. And I could spend hours sitting on the stoop of my apartment building just watching the life of the street unfold. And I had access to food from all over the world. But there was one thing that I missed, and this was access to nature. And so I started to explore the community gardens in my neighborhood, of which there were many, each with their own unique characteristics. And in these gardens, I met people who I otherwise would probably not have had the chance to interact with. I remember this older woman named Carmen who would bring seeds back from her native Puerto Rico, and she would tell me about what she was going to grow with these seeds and how she would use it in her cooking. I remember the young single mom who was trying to keep her sons off the street by getting them engaged in a project to build a garden hut so that elderly people in the neighborhood would have a place to relax. And I remember my interactions with this very eccentric artist named Eddie. Now, Eddie had spent several decades building a tower out of found wood and objects and toys that he had collected from the trash around the neighborhood. And at the age of 70, Eddie could still scale the 65-foot tower, and he would sit up there for hours, and he'd keep an eye on the neighborhood and on the garden. And no one knew he was there. So these gardens became a living room to me. They were places where I went not only to garden, but to share food, to listen to music, to tell stories, to play cards. And they were a living room to many other people. They were a place where age and race seemed invisible, where hope and collaboration were evident, and where cultures and traditions were being exchanged. But there was another side to this story. So the gardens had been founded in the 1970s when many neighborhoods in New York City and in many North American cities had gone through a period of decline, and property owners had simply walked away from their land. They had left vacant lots and vacant buildings. And so residents wanting to clean up their neighborhood had started to clean up these lots and remove the trash and turn these spaces into green spaces. Well, the city, having inherited all of these vacant lots, saw the positive impact that these gardens were having, and so they gave the residents temporary leases to use this space. When I moved to New York City, the neighborhood had started going through a period of revitalization, and the gardens were still noted on city maps as vacant land. And so the gardens started to be sold off, and the leases were revoked, and the gardens were left to the bulldozer. Now, because I had become so invested in these gardens, I wanted to figure out what could be done to save them. And so I started to look at land use policies, and I started to think about what you might do to prevent this from happening. I started to try and figure out who made decisions about city-owned land and how are those decisions made. And then I got involved with organizations and other individuals in advocacy campaigns. So we wrote letters to council members. We attended and spoke at council meetings, at planning commission meetings. We participated in events that would draw the media, such as a large street event that went through the neighborhood one day every year with puppets and music and performances that would draw attention to the gardens. And slowly our voices started to be heard. Not all of the gardens were saved. In fact, the garden where I had a plot was bulldozed for development. But slowly, some of the gardens were preserved under a land trust that was maintained by a nonprofit organization. And these gardens, people started to recognize, had become as vital to the neighborhood and as vital to its revitalization as anything that could be developed in its place. Now, I wasn't yet an urban planner, but this made an impact on me, and it went on to really inform my role as an urban planner. And I learned several important things. One thing I learned was that great public spaces have a way of uplifting a neighborhood, and they create a pride of place. Another thing I learned is that urban planners can play a very important role. They can put in place the right land use policies to make sure that a neighborhood has enough open space. But the most important thing I learned was that regardless of the right land use policies and decisions, these gardens were important because the residents had invested their own time and effort into them. They had added the texture and the character to each of these gardens. They were there because people cared and because they wanted them to have a future. Now, you might be thinking, what does this have to do with Regina? I'm not suggesting that we should go out and clean up vacant lots. We have many beautiful community gardens and park space. But I think this points to the fact that sometimes there are opportunities right before us and we fail to see them. Or that we expect that somebody else will take the initiative or the responsibility to do something for us. So I'd like to talk about another example. This one with a less hopeful outcome than that of the community gardens. And it's a story about parking, and it takes place in Los Angeles. In the 1980s, a woman named Vivian Disney gave a large donation for a concert hall to be built in the name of her husband, Walt Disney. And in order to make sure this was a landmark building, the well-known Canadian architect Frank Gehry was hired to design this space. Now, the project had many fiscal setbacks, and it was eventually finished in 2003, 7 years after it was anticipated to be done. And at that time, a professor at UCLA in planning, a man named Donald Shope, who has now come to be known as the parking guru, wanted to look at the effects of this concert hall when it opened. And here's what he found. So a site had been chosen for the concert hall that was northwest of downtown, and the idea was that bringing thousands of people to this new place would help revitalize the neighborhood. But the parking requirements on the site required that there were a whopping 2,188 parking spaces. There was nearly one parking space for every seat in the auditorium. And the parking had to be cheap because they had to pay for it, and parking garages are not expensive. The cost was nearly half the price of the entire concert hall. And so in order to pay for it, they had to make the parking cheap so it could compete with other parking in the neighborhood. So here's what happened. People came to the concert hall. They drove into the parkade. They parked their car. They took the elevator to the performance. They took the elevator back to the parkade. They got in their car and they drove away. And so much to the dismay of planners and business owners and potential investors, no one actually visited the neighborhood. And so what had happened was that in trying to solve one problem, that is the problem of parking, they had created yet another problem, and that was that the parking requirements had prohibited anyone from spending any time in the neighborhood. Had they had to walk or park their car down the block, they might have explored the neighborhood and they might have provided some opportunity for revitalization. Now, I use this example because I think sometimes we fail to see the unintended consequences of our actions. We think that abundant parking will bring us to a neighborhood, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee, as in this example, that it'll be a place we want to spend time. But here's where everyone can contribute. We can think about how we might want to explore a neighborhood. We can take time and make a commitment to check out that new local restaurant that just opened, or spend time getting to know a new place. And I'd like to bring these ideas now into a local example. So Reginans are incredibly generous. We give money to 50-50s. We buy food at bake sales. We participate in all sorts of fundraising events. In fact, according to Statistics Canada, Saskatchewan has the highest rate of volunteerism of all provinces in Canada. But I'd like to propose another form of generosity, and this is to ask you, how might you make your city or your neighborhood just a slightly better place to be? Using the examples I've given, how could you be the person who helped clean up the vacant lot? Or the person who spent time getting to know a neighborhood before going to an event at the Disney concert hall? And I'll provide some examples because I see them all over Regina and I see them increasing all the time. So in the Cathedral neighborhood, someone has put a bench on their front yard next to the bus stop so that people on College Avenue have a place to sit while they wait for the bus. A few blocks away, someone has installed a little free library, which you see all over Regina, where you can leave a book or take a book, and it becomes a small gathering hub for the block. A few doors down, someone has put a street lamp in their front yard, and this is, when it's lit at night, makes the corner feel safe. In the Heritage neighborhood last fall, a local resident named Adam Smith got a donation from the Community Association to plant over 1,000 tulips throughout the neighborhood, and they're in bloom this spring. And last September, a local group called the Regina Advocates for Design participated in something called Parking Day, in which they got a permit from the city to take over a single parking space and to create a gathering space or a parklet where people could sit and gather. Now, events like Parking Day or temporary installations like Parking Day, if done successfully, have a way of becoming more permanent. In a town I lived in Northern California, a temporary Parking Day installation shown here became a semi-permanent one. But the reason for this becoming a more permanent installation is an interesting story in itself and more unique than perhaps some of the Parking Day installations I've seen. So several months before the installation of this, we call it the Boardwalk, business owners had gone to council and they had asked for anti-loitering legislation. What had happened was that there was a group of young adults who were spending large amounts of time during the day on a particular block. And the business owners felt that they were intimidating potential people who would come to their businesses. They were chasing away businesses and they were giving the block sort of the wrong identity. Well, a volunteer organization that I belonged to decided we would try and problem solve around this, that rather than using police enforcement to remove certain people from the block, we started to think about how we might solve the problem through another means. And one of the ideas that came forth was that what would happen if we actually just brought more people to this place? And so the idea of the Boardwalk was born, and through volunteer materials and effort, it was built and installed. And the change didn't happen overnight. The Boardwalk has been in place now for almost 4 years, but slowly the crowd started to evolve, and people would come and they would see the Boardwalk and they would linger and they would stop and they would interact. And so suddenly this space became a space of inclusion and of interaction rather than division and friction. Now, these examples can do many things for our neighborhoods. They can beautify a neighborhood. They can make it more socially inclusive. They can provide opportunities for social engagement. And in some cases, they can even make a place better for someone who is less fortunate. And this is another form of generosity that we can all engage in. I'm sure many of you have ideas that you've seen in Regina or in other great cities you visited. And I'm sure there's a little part of you that is saying, this will never happen in Regina. We've got 6 months of winter. You're thinking, people in my neighborhood don't walk. There isn't an opportunity for something like this. Or you're thinking, we're rural people at our core. We don't aspire to be urban. Or you're wondering, what would my neighbors think? But I can assure you that no matter what kind of neighborhood you live in Regina, in what location, there's probably something little you can do that would make it a slightly better place to be. There was probably some act of generosity that would be beneficial. However, if you're not convinced by the examples I've given today, perhaps you'll be convinced by a little bit of scientific research. In 2013, a Canadian journalist named Charles Montgomery wrote a book called The Happy City. And he looked at the research of scientists and psychologists, planners, engineers, and many others, and he wanted to answer one simple question. From an urban perspective, what makes us happy? And the answer to this question, he found, was actually quite simple and universal. What makes us happy is access to nature, the opportunity for social interaction, and spaces and buildings that we feel comfortable in. When he looked at neighborhoods without these qualities, so places with vast open spaces like surface parking lots, big box stores with few windows or doors and blank facades, he found that people were more anxious, they were less hopeful, and they actually were also less happy and less healthy. Now, by contrast, neighborhoods that had these elements, people felt more engaged, they were happier, and they actually lived longer. So Montgomery actually found evidence, scientific evidence, that the kind of places we live in actually inform our health. Now, I'm not suggesting that Regina needs to go out and borrow all the examples that I've given from other cities. We have many great spaces here in the city. We have places like Scarce Street and 13th Avenue, and the success of these spaces can be shown by the number of people who spend time in these places. So rather than aspiring to be like Toronto or Paris or New York, we can draw on the characteristics we already have. We can draw on our Saskatchewan pride and our Saskatchewan generosity. So in closing, I would ask you to think about the places that you enjoy now, why you enjoy them and how you benefit from them, and to think about how through some small intervention or action, you might make your neighborhood or city just a slightly better place to be, because this type of generosity might make us all happier and healthier. Thank you.